Okay, we continue on in our Parashah with this, these are the ordinances. What is an ordinance? A law, right. Just another name for a law that is oftentimes viewed as extremely practical in terms of everyday living. There are some laws which are on in our times, law books, that I never have to worry about. You know, it says if you have a trailer and a truck so long that you have to observe certain laws. I won't ever have to do that because I don't plan to be a truck driver and have those long trailers. So, but when we talk about an ordinance, it's usually things that everybody is dealing with on a regular basis, and that's where we started last week, and we're continuing on. It says the purpose of the ordinances given by God in the Torah are essentially twofold. First, they are given in order to set God's people apart from those who trust in false gods. We read that in Deuteronomy 4. As the ways of God are lived out by His people, they are set apart unto Him and from the paganism of the nations. We have the opportunity in our time to be set apart in ways that are significant. We have to be careful. We can't be going around acting like we're vigilantes or whatever. But there is a demarcation today, if we're willing to live in it, that marks us out very clearly as different. And it's always been the case, but it seems like in our society it's become more and more evident. Do you feel that way? There are things that 50 years ago, or maybe 40 years ago, the society that we're in would have considered to be absolutely wrong and abhorrent. That is, I'm talking about the majority of the society. And today, those same things are viewed as not only acceptable, but as necessary for a society. I continue to feel that we are on a downward slide that is accelerating in our society. But we have the ability to shine forth the truth. And the truth sets people free as God gives them that desire to see His way. Well, so the ordinances of God are given to His people in order to establish a firm and wise foundation for interpersonal relationships. Do you see, everything within a society ultimately rests upon interpersonal relationships, right? If you hate your neighbor, what's going to happen? You're going to do things, or fail to do things, with regard to your neighbor, and that's only going to escalate, right? Have any of you had that situation? We've watched it at times, even in our own neighborhood. One neighbor knocks down part of the fence of the next door neighbor, and then you hear, well, why did you do that? Well, it was leaning over. Why didn't you repair it? So I figured if I knocked it over, that you would finally get the message that you need to do something about this. Oh, I'll do something about it. Don't worry. And the next thing you know, there's a fence that's 2 foot over on the wrong property. And that just escalates, right? And the next thing you know, there's this tug-of-war between. What does it mean to love your neighbor? Well, it's not only in our text to love your neighbor, it means to love even your enemy. Right? Did you read where it says if you're the animal of the enemy, of the person you don't like, it doesn't mean somebody who's coming to take your life. It means someone that has been contrary to you. And you see their animal in need. What are you supposed to do? Help them. Do you suppose Yeshua had that in mind when He said, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who despitefully use you? That can be within a community, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be someone out there that you've hardly ever met. It can be somebody that is regularly part of your, weekly or regular friendships and community. How are we doing on that? We need to show love. Did God love us when we were his enemies? Yes. And he brought us to himself. Well, he gives us some very interesting things. The first is about interest. The text says that you're not to charge interest to my people. So, and your one is not to charge interest when loaning money to someone in need. The word for interest is neshek, which means to bite. Now, I know there's been controversies on this. Well, what if you're in a business and your business is to loan money? You know, I understand there's issues. But this is talking about someone who's in need. And when you charge interest to someone who's in need, what are you doing? You're making it more difficult than ever for them to pay back the loan. So this is all part of loving one's neighbor. Well, in Deuteronomy 23, it's specifically permitted to charge interest, that is, to a foreigner who is passing through, a noker, as distinguished from a ger who has taken up residence within Israel. This most likely, I believe, denotes a foreign merchant who seeks a loan to further his business. Maybe someone is coming through and just stops and says, you know, they don't tell you that they're out of money, but there they are, and all of a sudden they come and they're part of your circle, and maybe you're meeting them in the village or you're in a town or whatever, you're seeing them regularly, and finally they say, hey, is there any chance you could give me a loan? I'll be sure to pay it back. Well, you can say yes, but you're also able to charge interest. And the point is that if you charge interest and they're making payments, which was typical in the ancient world, their payment would be larger, right? Because the interest would be accrued on each payment, which means you would get your principal back more quickly. Well, someone who's just passing through, you might not be wise to give them a loan. But on the other hand, if they're hanging around and they seem to be doing some work or whatever, at least you're going to get your money back, the principal back, before you otherwise would if you charge interest. That may be what's going on here. So this principle also relates to what our Torah text talked about, taking your neighbor's cloak. What does that mean? It probably means the cloak is given for a down payment. But you're not supposed to keep it. You're supposed to let him have it because it's what he needs for sleeping at night. In this case, the poor person is given what might be his only valuable possession and something he needed for maintaining daily life. The pledge or collateral is given as a symbolic intention to repay the loan. But since the dignity and freedom of the poor is not to be violated, the cloak must be returned before the day is over. In other words, we're to care for people in a greater way than we care for our money. Now, that's a blank statement. We still have to be wise with our money. But when we're talking about helping the poor, helping someone truly who is in need, and you know, I have to be honest, and I think you would agree with me, in our day and age, you have to really assess whether the person's in need or not. I mean, you all probably get the same kind of spam mail I get, you know. Especially because we have a website that is, TorahResource is religious, and so I get a lot of emails saying I'm down and out, and can you please help me? And I simply don't follow through on any of those unless I have a chance to actually talk with the person and meet them and so forth and so on. But so the scriptures still require us to be wise. But in wisdom, we should have hearts of compassion. The Almighty himself has a special care for the poor, and thus he will carefully look after their needs, according to Deuteronomy 24. God's own compassion for the poor is to be the pattern followed by the creditor. It is from this principle that even in our own modern jurisprudence, the necessities of life cannot be extracted from a debtor, even in the worst-case scenario, that is bankruptcy. Why, on our law books, if someone is impoverished and has to declare bankruptcy, their living quarters cannot be taken away from them? The necessities for life have to remain. Where did they get that? They got it from this. Isn't it amazing that our nation, in its very beginning, had these kinds of biblical principles that found their way into basic laws. Well, this whole idea of God's own compassion is to set the standard for one's actions as well as one's willingness to submit to judges in civil matters, flows easily into the next section of our Parashah, namely one's duties toward God. You shall not curse God nor curse a ruler of your people. Now, I agree with the interpretation that in our text, the word Elohim, which we found also in our previous Parashah, in Exodus 21:6 and 22:8 through 9, is not referring to the Almighty God, but it's referring to judges. Because the judges have been given by God the right of life and death. Do you realize that there can be a judge who, if he or she hits the gavel and says guilty, that the person loses their life? That's becoming less and less the case. Many states have outlawed the death penalty, but on a federal level it still is there. To have the power of saying, yes, you have committed a crime worthy of death, is power that only those designated by God should have. Well, even in a godless country like ours, or becoming more and more like that, it becomes absolute anarchy and chaos if we do not follow what God says. That is, we must be willing to submit to those who have the rule over us. That's why we're to pray for them, according to 1 Timothy 2, right? So Paul quotes this verse after realizing that he had spoken against the high priest in Acts 23:5. You shall not curse God nor curse a ruler of your people. Apparently he was unaware that the high priest was presiding over the council at his trial. Was his eyesight poor enough that he could not see all who were in attendance? Some have suggested that, and that because at the end of Philippians, one of his epistles, he says, "See with what large letters I write." And some have considered that the thorn in the flesh, which God did not take away from him, but gave him ability to live through, was that he was losing his eyesight. We don't know, but that's maybe possible. Well, regardless, realizing this error, he submits to the ruler on the basis of our Torah text, which teaches that insubordination against God-appointed rulers is equivalent to insubordination against God himself. Now, there can be a lot of debate about God-appointed rulers. As citizens of this country, we are required to submit to those who gain office through the proper channels, whether we agree with them or not. And that's why I think it is always wise for us to pray that God would give us leaders who would not take away our liberties and our ability to do what he wants us to do. So honoring God and his appointed leaders is now linked to the giving of the first fruits of the crops, the herds, and even the firstborn of one's children, who were redeemed, of course. Our verse indicates that the first fruits are the choicest portion of the crop. The wording is somewhat ambiguous, but one commentator, Sarna, I like a lot of what he does, translates your crop in full bloom, namely the best part of it. God, speaking in the first person, instructs that one is to give the first fruits to me. This was understood to mean that first fruits were given to the priesthood who served before the Lord. Now, isn't it interesting that in the emerging Christian church, they said, you know, that some of the early church fathers referred to the top bishop as the high priest. This is where Roman Catholicism came and got the word priest for their leaders. They took the laws relating to the priesthood and took them over into the emerging Christian church. Of course, you don't have the Roman Catholic Church until the 4th or 5th century, but by that time they were very much using that terminology. And they said, therefore, you're supposed to bring your offering to the priest, just like Leviticus says, or just like Deuteronomy says. Say, wait a minute. Is he from the tribe of Judah? Is he from the tribe of Levi? Okay, you get my point. What is the subject of first fruits? It's that we're supposed to be willing to give the best to him. It's not the last of the crop. We have a fig tree in our yard, and there aren't many fig trees in Tacoma that I know of. We don't really have the climate for it. We always have figs that never get ripe. There's usually 2 croppings of the fig tree. The first ones come right away, and they're nice and wonderful to eat if you can keep the deer from eating them all. But then there are these small ones that come later, and our season isn't long enough for them to ripen and to use. And so the same thing would happen at times in the land of Israel. There would be times where the season would be shortened for some reason because of the weather and so forth. So the first part of the crop was always considered to be the best. We have it, it's ripe, it's ready to go, we can store it. And if the second cropping doesn't come out, then okay. No, supposed to give the tithe of the first fruits to the Lord. What does that tell us? What are we to learn from that? Everything we have, every good gift, every perfect gift comes down from the Father of light, with whom there is no, not fathers of lights, which is different than the lights in the sky, right? Which go through phases. Sometimes they're dark, sometimes they're light. No, not true with our God. His light is always shining. We're to give him that. Why? Because we are saying, everything I have comes from you. Therefore, I don't hesitate to give back to you. What if he doesn't supply your needs? Then what? Then I guess you didn't need it. Guess I didn't need it. Right? I mean, that's the logical conclusion from what the Scriptures teach. Sometimes he's probably teaching us lessons about how to not squander what we already have. Wisdom goes along with it. Or the wrong motives, right? Or, yeah, to give somebody else the opportunity to obey him, to help us. And some of us don't like to be helped. Right? I mean, it's like, no, I can do it myself. Oh, what is this, confession time? No doubt. Chapter 23 of our Parashah begins by stressing the need for justice to prevail within the covenant community. Not only does justice require wise and honest judges, specifically detailed in the previous Parashah, but it likewise requires honest witnesses. In chapter 23, in the first 3 verses of our Parashah, offer 5 prohibitions. One cannot give unfounded hearsay testimony in judicial proceedings. What is hearsay? You come forward as a witness and you say, I can be a witness of that crime. And then they say, were you an eyewitness? An eyewitness. You actually saw it happen. Now, if you say yes and you're lying, then that's even worse. Or if you're honest, you say, no, I was talking to my neighbor and he saw the crime and he told me about it. You can't be a witness. Secondly, collusion on the part of a witness with one of the parties for a fraudulent or deceitful purpose is prohibited. It's called witness tampering in our day. And not to bring up bad times, but this is one of the reasons that some of us were remaining quiet about things that others wanted us to declare guilty or innocent. Because we found out from years ago that when we as a community discuss a crime, and some of us are witnesses to that crime, then everyone is tainted. And we'd best not do that. We best be sure that we know what we see and be a witness to it and do what God says. Thirdly, no consideration is to be given to the social standing of the litigants. Just because somebody is going to give you a job doesn't mean that you hold back from telling the truth about what he's being charged with. Or just because he's a good friend of yours, or just because whatever. And of course, we have this in the James passage, right? Somebody comes in with a gold ring, and boy, this guy's got money. All right, we're going to give him the best seat in the house. And here comes another poor soul who, is tattered clothing and so forth and so on, obviously poor. And you say, hey, why don't you sit on the floor over there? Yeah. No, we're not to do that. Fourthly, one is not to pervert justice by deferring to the majority view if one is convinced that it's erroneous. That's tough, isn't it? You're going to be the only person in the school council to stand up and say something's wrong? Ooh, that's what we're supposed to do. And fifthly, even though the Torah regularly enjoins compassion for the poor, one is not to allow their emotions, however noble, to color one's judgments. There has to be wisdom. There has to be proof. So, all of this comes down to doing good to those who hate you, as Yeshua taught us in Luke 6:27. By helping in the common issues of life, like helping to return an animal that has strayed, or helping an unload a too heavy burden from an animal. In our day, what would that be like in our day? People aren't usually walking past your house with a goat or a camel or something, you know. What would it be, Nancy? Yeah. Yeah, right. Exactly. So there's a flat tire, and there's no one to help, and there's a need, and gratefully, as being part of this community, it was all taken care of. So, yes, those are the kinds of things. When we see someone in need, when we see someone, hurting and needs help. When I was back in seminary and I was working at a parking garage downtown, I would stand out in front of the parking garage a little bit, just on the sidewalk, because we had all of the cars from a medical clinic just down the street. And we all knew the doctors and the nurses and so forth. And when we saw them coming, we knew what car they drove. And so we'd go get their car and get it ready so that they didn't have to wait. But we'd stand there and wait to see who was coming. As I was standing there, there was an elderly man who was shuffling by. And right in front of me, he tripped and fell flat on his face right on the sidewalk. You kind of go, and so I helped him up, and I said, let me call the ambulance. He said, no, don't call ambulance. I said, okay, but I want you to come in and sit down here, and we'll get you cleaned up. It's easy when you see that kind of thing happening. But what about when we see somebody who is living on the streets these days? How do we help them? That's tough. Sometimes they don't want to listen. Sometimes they don't want the help that you want to give them, because usually they're on the streets either because there's mental illness or because they're addicted to a substance or something like that. I know as we walked past many of them in San Diego 2 weeks ago, and I've heard that it's even worse in Seattle and LA and some other places. It's a dilemma. How do we reach out to these people who are in such great need? We need to ask the Lord to give us some kind of answer to that as we seek to honor Him. And did I? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, let's take it to the extreme. If we saw someone who was clearly dressed as a Muslim and had a flat tire and was unable to fix it, would we help them? I hope we would. I hope we would, because that might be the first introduction to them understanding that there are people who aren't Muslims who still care about them. Yeah, absolutely. Well, our Torah portion talks about justice. What do we do with, this is why it's important for us to be praying and being involved where we're able. When we have a voice as to judges, we should be careful with that, right? Because God requires us to submit to them. The judge, there's specifically things told to the judge, right? The judge is not to take a bribe. What does a bribe do? Well, it ruins justice. There's all kinds of bribes. In fact, the rabbis, the rabbinic literature on this text says that you're not allowed to say wonderful things to the judge. Like, oh, Your Honor, I really like the suit you're wearing. That is so beautiful. That's a verbal bribe. I'm so glad that you were elected to this office. I think you are the one that was most qualified for this office. Yes. Yes, you're right. It's a good thing Paul didn't follow rabbinical practices when he said you're a toddling wall. Yeah. Yeah. It's an honor to be before you, Agrippa. Yeah. No.
About a year ago, I had the interesting experience of serving on a jury for the first time.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think anybody goes looking for serving on a jury. It's kind of boring most of the time. And it was, obviously this is modern American jurisprudence and not biblical.
Yeah.
But the judge decides what is evidence and what is not evidence.
Right.
And you can't ask for anything more than what
is evidence?
they give you.
Yeah, right.
And the way it turned out, I was the holdout, and it was a hung jury.
Whoa.
And the judge said that in 6 years he'd never had a hung jury. But what they presented as evidence, in my opinion, was a joke. And it mocked the legal system.
Yeah.
I didn't believe either party.
Yeah. I know it's a dilemma. I've heard this from numbers of others who have served in the same capacity, and they were just, they're wringing their hands saying, what do I do here? I know for certain I can't agree, but I'm going to be the holdout, and I'm going to be looked at as...
Tough.
Yeah, it is. You're right. But we must do what is right before the Lord. Okay, our text also talks about the Shemitah, the sabbatical year. And I just want to emphasize again, regardless of those who may teach it differently, the scriptures are quite clear that the sabbatical year applies only to the land of Israel. It says, when you enter the land, you shall allow the land. So the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year, is Sabbath with regard to years, like the weekly Sabbath is regard to weeks. Okay? And ultimately, what is that to remind us about? It's to remind us that God is the giver of all things, and that we can have one day out of the realm of work and gaining, and we could even have a whole year. If we were in the agricultural society, there could be a whole year where God could still supply our needs. Of course, we know agriculturally that allowing a field to lay fallow for a season is good for it. Right? They do that, in the Palouse country here in Washington, where they grow all the wheat. Well, growing up over in Spokane, there were farmers that would come to our church, and they would say, oh, well, we're letting this field be fallow this year. And I learned about it when I was in junior high and high school. They explained it to me. The soil needs to be rejuvenated, and et cetera, and that's what's, well, did God do it for that reason? Maybe that's part of it, but also it is because to say that observing the Sabbath and for the farmers in the land to observe the Shemitah is a constant reminder that I must trust God. I must do what He says and trust for the outcome. And then it talks about the three feasts that were so-called pilgrimage feasts, that is going up to Jerusalem. And we've gone over those a number of times. We'll do it more, but I'm trying to cover this whole thing today. Yeah, question. Yeah, in other words, okay, let me reiterate that. Shouldn't we find an application to our life even if we can't observe it in the terms of the way the Torah says? Sure, the application, as I said, is that we are to trust God. But He does say in some cases, you shall do this wherever you reside. In which case, this is the true with the festivals and with the Sabbath. Throughout all your generations. Okay? So, I guess what I'm saying is those who are teaching that the reason that this country or that country, mostly it's just this country, they're saying, the reason that there's some financial downturn or whatever is because we're not observing the Shemitah year. We've never observed the Shemitah year. So when there's real growth in economics. What does that mean? People are selling a lot of books. Okay? We ought to be saying, taking those things that are being taught, lay it against the Scriptures and say, is that what the Scriptures say? And I don't know. I have another book for his to read. You know who I'm talking about. So, a recent book came out saying that Moses prophesied the coming of Mark Twain to Israel. Oh yeah, it's a bestseller now. It's an absolute. It's a New York bestseller. Yeah. Pardon me? I don't know. Yeah. What does it mean? Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's been a. You know that the Orthodox take that to mean that you don't ever eat meat and milk together. No, that's not what it means. There's nothing in the Scriptures that say you have to separate meat and milk. Okay. Can we have the microphone up here? We've got a hand. Put your hand up again, Nancy. There it is.
Is it on? Okay. You know what? I wrote this in my study Bible because this is one that I have really challenged myself to be a Berean, because you hear so many voices, especially in the rabbinic community. And I really want to know, when they go to the extreme of separating of meat and dairy and the dishes, and, I really sought the Lord. I've never had a peace about it. But this is what I read, okay, by a Dr. Cudworth, who is a comment of a Karaite Jew, okay? And he states, it was a custom of the ancient heathen, when they had gathered in all their fruit, to take a kid and boil it in its mother's milk, and then, in a magical way, as a charm, to sprinkle all the trees, the field, the gardens, and the orchards, to make them fruitful. So this is a prohibition against imitating the superstitious rites of the idolaters in Egypt at the end of their harvest, to use this magical charm. And 2, it's the law of cruelty, not slaying a young kid with its dam. So comment on that for me.
Okay. Does that writer give you any sources for what he's saying?
I can't remember.
Okay. Well,
Yes, he did, but I don't know. Everything's past, and I don't know.
yeah. I think the sources that he gave were other modern writers. Yes. As far as I have studied, there's nothing in ancient literature that indicates that this was going on at the time when Moses is writing this. In fact, there's nothing whatsoever in the Canaanite literature that is extant, nothing whatsoever in the Assyrian and other kinds of ancient Near Eastern literature that have any rituals of boiling a kid in its mother's milk as a paganism. Now, there was a line that was found at Rashamra. If you're familiar with Ugaritic, this is at the bottom of page 7. Was thought to include a reference to boiling a kid in milk. This was the earliest reference that anyone had ever found. Line 14 of that text, entitled "The Gods Pleasant and Beautiful," was translated, "Boil a kid in milk, a lamb in butter, as a sacrifice to the gods which they worshipped." This appeared to give credence to the idea that our biblical text related to a pagan sacrificial ritual. However, more recently, Ugaritic scholars have reassessed the cuneiform characters and decided that this original translation has no basis. New photographs were taken from these are all stones, okay? They're clay, and then they would use a reed. A reed had a wedged, if they cut then they would stick the reed in it to make these wedge shapes to make cuneiform. So they're kind of hard to read after they've been around for thousands of years. But anyway, though the exact translation remains uncertain, current scholarship almost universally denies that the Ugaritic text can be used to posit a pagan sacrificial ritual which would inform our current text. In fact, now, I think since I wrote this, they are saying it means that they are determined that the cuneiform there means lettuce, L-E-T-T-U-C-E, the leafy vegetable. So it means cook your meat with this leafy vegetable and give that to the gods. So I think, given the data that we have. What other laws would even relate to anything like this? The closest one I can find, you're not supposed to take the egg from the nest while the hen is there, or the chicklet from the nest while the mother bird is there. You're supposed to wait for the mother bird to go away and then take it. Why is that? Well, because there is something to be said for a humanitarian care of animals. We're not supposed to just butcher animals alive for the fun of it. In fact, when we butcher animals for food, we're supposed to do it in the most humane way possible. So given these data, I think perhaps the best we can do in interpreting this prohibition is to suggest that humanitarian concerns are primary. During festivals, when so many animals were slaughtered and sacrificed, there was still to be a recognition that the life, by the way, in the context here, it's talking about going to the festivals. So it sounds like it's a festival sacrifice. There was still to be a recognition that the life of the animal is important to God and must be properly appreciated. More directly, the relationship between mother and offspring is not to be violated. So to take the milk of the mother and use that to boil a kid is to disregard the relationship, even in animal life, between the giver of life, the mother, and her offspring. Is the mic on? Right now.
I can't help but wonder if some of these things, like where it talks about cutting the edges of your hair type things, may have been for a generation other than ours, but God in His wisdom knew to put it in there so that whatever practices or however related that particular time was to be avoided.
Well, in that case, the scarring of it doesn't say to cut, it actually says to plow. That was common and is known in the literature of ancient Near Eastern paganism. They did scar themselves on the head,
Yeah.
and then make it so that the hair would not grow. And they would take knife and scar in images and so forth. So that clearly is related to paganism. But boiling a kid in its mother's milk for years and years and years, the scholarship was saying it must have been a pagan sacrifice. And many people writing about it have copied that. And more modern research is saying there's no such evidence. Yeah. Just push the bottom button. Do we have the mic on? Yeah.
Hello? Oh, good job. I'm reflecting here on how I see we've had some interaction with Israelis and trying to, and I recently read a book on you bring the bagels and I'll bring the gospel, on how to talk to Jewish people and how to interact with them. And I just think about how so many Christians look at these things and say, oh, that's just stupid. We don't have that anymore. You shouldn't think about that. And I think we can be offensive to the very people that we would like to interact with. And I think sometimes something of avoiding meat and milk is not going to affect us in our salvation.
No.
And there's no reason we can't
you could
go along with that in order not to offend. This was just brought home to me recently because honestly I just had one of the biggest challenges of my life, which is going to sound a little silly maybe to some, but we had some Israelis over for Thanksgiving. And I discovered the week before that there was something was gluten-free, and we couldn't do the meat and dairy together. And I made a complete Thanksgiving meal, gluten-free and dairy-free. And it was the craziest thing I've ever done. But honestly, what we got from that was just shock.
Yeah,
They were shocked that we ministered to them in such a meaningful way.
Yeah, sure.
I
Absolutely.
believe it gave us an inroad
Yeah,
to talk about something
yeah,
even more important, like the Messiah.
yeah, good. Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm saying is that it's not a biblical commandment, but it doesn't mean that we can't accommodate those who believe that it is when necessary. We had was it the mayor of Shiloh? David Rubin. We had him at our house. And he's Hasidic, Orthodox, whatever. And so we've simply said, we're going to give you paper plates because we don't have, according to him, kosher kitchen. And we're giving him everything that was kosher and no meat and milk mixed. And he was very appreciative of that. So there's no reason why we can't accommodate that as long as we're not disobeying the Scriptures. Right, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, we even set aside things, especially if he came again, so that when he comes, he knows that he can eat at our place and not be concerned.
And I just wanted to clarify, how I feel. Scripture says, be all things to all men, and I believe you should honor the community that you're in. Beit HaShafar does separation of meat and dairy, okay, but they have a different vision.
Yeah.
Okay, it's for an Orthodox Jew.
Right.
I've seen where Orthodox Jews have come into that Messianic synagogue. They didn't even know. They thought it was an Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so he has, their Tukwila, Seattle. That was their whole purpose.
Right.
So I understand all that, and I believe the same way. I go to there, then I do as the community does to honor them.
Right. It's interesting, when we were talking about this, I didn't know we were getting on this topic, but it's a good one. We have to be careful, however. When we look at Paul, we have the best illustration of evangelism being lived out over a period of time from Paul, because he's written the most, Paul didn't seem at times that it was necessary to accommodate. I think sometimes, and don't get me wrong, I think it's okay to accommodate, but I think we have to be careful not to accommodate to the point where we're not willing to do what we know is going to be offensive to them. What I've seen time and time again, and I've visited numbers of Messianic congregations in the past, what I've seen is those, in fact, we talked with someone just at the ETS meeting, or the SBL meeting, some well-known name, I won't give it to you, in the Messianic movement. And it's very clear that's what's happening in some cases, is they are hiding Yeshua in order not to offend. And, you can accommodate all you want, but if you say, we believe Yeshua is the true Messiah, oh no, maybe you're not going to be saying that right up front, but at some point, that's, it's a stumbling block to the Jews and offensive to the Greeks. Right? Isn't that what the Scriptures say? So at some point, we have to be willing to say, okay, Lord, help me to be a witness the way you want me to be a witness. Let me speak even if I think it could be controversial, but do it in a way that will not offend by my own offense. If the gospel is an offense, that's okay. Nothing I can do about that. So, I know what you're saying. I mean, when we started out Beit Hallel, we had some of this in mind too. It's like, how could we invite our unbelieving Jewish friends and acquaintances in and not have them just immediately turn around and leave? Until the fellow came in with a bright pink shirt that said, Yeshua makes you treif. He makes you unclean. Well, then we had to do something about that. No. When God is ready, when God makes a person ready to hear the gospel, we want to be ready to give it. But we have to maintain some kind of contact in order to do that. We can't just cut people off. All right, I want to end with this. At the end of our portion, our Torah portion, it talked about the angel of the Lord in chapter 23, verses 20 through 23. The exhortation to Israel that She should be wholly given over to the worship of God alone and not give way to any of the pagan practices that surrounded her. And there were commands. You're to be on guard before him. A second command, obey his voice. And a third command, do not rebel against him. It sounds like this angel of the Lord comes with authority that is... So I want to ask you this question. And you don't answer, please, just think about it. Well, you know my answer. Is Yeshua Yod-He-Vav-He? Now, what is Yod-He-Vav-He? That's the four-letter name of God that we don't know how to pronounce. Again, if I knew how to pronounce it, I would. I'm not superstitious about pronouncing the name. I wouldn't do it around those who think it's, an unforgivable sin. But nonetheless, we don't know how to pronounce it, so I don't want to mispronounce his name any more than I'd want to mispronounce somebody else's name, So, especially for him, because he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So, we say Hashem or we say Adonai or whatever. But is Yeshua Yod-He-Vav-He in the flesh? Absolutely. And there are major teachers in the Messianic movement who will not be pinned down on this. There's one that we talked to directly and said, would you confess that Yeshua is Yod-He-Vav-He in the flesh? He said, no, I would say he's God in the flesh. Well, why not Yod-He-Vav-He? And he said something to the effect that the Bible doesn't speak that way. Oh, really? Someone else said, well, Yod-He-Vav-He is a family name. So you've got the Father who is Yod-He-Vav-He, you've got the Son who is Yod-He-Vav-He, and you've got the Spirit who is Yod-He-Vav-He. But when you're talking about Yod-He-Vav-He, it's talking about the Father, because the Father is the one who gives birth to the children, and the Son and the Spirit are like family members. And then there was one other person who said, no, the Father is Yod-He-Vav-He, and Yeshua is God, and the Spirit is divine. They say, well, then are there three gods? Well, yes, but they're all one. Well, okay, they're trying to make sense of this mystery, right? So I want to talk to you about what we have in Isaiah 49, and I hope I don't have too much here. You don't have this in a handout anywhere, but if you want to download these slides, they're up on the Beit Hallel site, okay? The nation of Israel as the Lord's servant to be a light to the nations. Is that what the prophet means when he says in our text, the servant of the Lord? Well, it can mean the nation, right? Israel is viewed as the servant of the Lord. Or it can refer to the coming promised Messiah, who is the divine servant of the Lord, and thus the quintessential Israelite, the King of Israel. When you read our text carefully, did you read it? It says, you are my servant, O Israel. But then it says, my servant is coming who will turn Israel. Wait a minute. Yeah, both and. Yeshua is the one to whom all are to be conformed. It is by his saving work that the remnant of Israel is enabled to be a light to the nations, so that the elect from the nations will join the redeemed of Israel in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. He says, that he would be a light to the nations, even to the far-off islands and so forth. We see the same motif used of the ecclesia, usually translated as church. Yeshua promised to build in Matthew 16:18, I will build my ecclesia, right? In that the ecclesia is to become like the Lord Yeshua and is thus called the body of Messiah. Is the ecclesia Messiah? No, but Messiah is the quintessential representation of the ecclesia, right? That's this language. If we're his body, then we're to be a representation of who he is, right? Ephesians 4:12, for the equipping, he said, I'm breaking into context, for the equipping of the saints for the work of service to the building up of the body of Messiah. What does it mean, the body of Messiah? Have you ever thought of that? If we're the body of the Messiah, we're vitally connected with him. And we're showing forth who he is, right? But then, this 1 Corinthians 12:12 has always been an enigma. For even as the body is one and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Messiah. It sounds like the body of the ecclesia is equated with Messiah. Why? Because Yeshua is the quintessential representation of the body known as the ecclesia. When he said, I will build my ecclesia, what did he mean? He means I will gather together a group of people that will give me the glory that is necessary. So, when we talk about this, the opening verses of our chapter are clearly speaking of an individual as the servant of the Lord and not the corporate nation of Israel. It starts out by talking about the corporate nation of Israel, but the rest of it is clearly about an individual. He says, listen to me, O islands, and pay attention, you peoples from afar. Adonai called me from the womb. Now, you could say, well, that could be of the nation of Israel, because the nation of Israel is sometimes in the scriptures referred to as being birthed. But the next phrase, from the body of my mother, he named me. He has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he has concealed me, and he has made me a select arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver. In other words, this is an individual. From the womb and from the body of my mother he named me. This is the one promised in 7:14 of Isaiah and 9:6 of Isaiah. From the womb could be understood, as I said, referring to corporate Israel. But you, Israel, my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend. Okay, in Isaiah. But now listen, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I have chosen. But when Isaiah adds, from the body of my mother he named me, this clearly speaks of an individual, the very one promised in Isaiah 7:14 and 9:6. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. And of course 9:6, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Owner of Eternity. I think that's how it should be translated. Not Eternal Father, but Father can mean owner. Owner of eternity, Prince of Peace. We see the divine servant of the Lord here in Isaiah 49. In verses 3 through 4, it shows the divine disappointment in Israel's waywardness, which is countered by the servant's reliance upon the decreed success of his work. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will show my glory. But I said, who's talking? But I have said. Now, the servant of the Lord, Yeshua, is talking. I have toiled in vain, I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity, yet surely the justice due to me is with Adonai, and my reward is with God. You say, well, he wouldn't say that, I have toiled in vain. Oh, yes, he would. God says to Israel, I have given to you, and I have given to you, and you just walk away. I've blessed you, and all you do is go off into the idols. I mean, read the Song of the Vineyard in chapter 5 of Isaiah. He said, I planted it, I nourished it, I did everything necessary. And look, it's not giving any fruit. I have to go and chop it all down. So this parallels the Song of the Yard, the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 5. Here in our text, verses 3 through 4, the name Israel refers to the Israel of God, the whole body of the redeemed, with Yeshua being the head. Thus Paul writes regarding Yeshua, he also is the head of the body, the ecclesia, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. That's what it means to be head of the ecclesia. For even as the body, as I said before, is one and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Messiah. Messiah and the body of the ecclesia is one. Next, we see the divine servant of the Lord confident in the success of his labors in verses 5 and 6. It describes this ultimate success of the servant's work, not only in enlarging the remnant of Israel to genuine faith and obedience, but also in gathering the elect from all the nations in fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. What Isaiah is saying, I'm prophesying of the one who's coming to make the promise made to Abraham a success, to bring it about. And how is he going to do that? Is he going to show up in the sky and just wave banners and say, "Here I am," and then leave and come back and go? No. How is he going to do that? How are all the nations going to hear? From us. From those who go. You know, we have something very interesting in America. We have a lot of people from the nations coming to America. They still got family back in the other nations. Right? When we had the privilege of sponsoring 6 Russian families when we that were immigrants and were refugees. When we gave them the gospel, how far is that going to go if they receive it and if they say, "Oh, I need to talk with mom and dad. They're back in the land, you know, in Russia and whatever." We have such an opportunity to spread the good news of the gospel. And now says Adonai, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of Adonai, and my God is my strength. He says, "It is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." And if you've ever done Jewish evangelism, you know when he says it's a small thing. Well, for God it's a small thing. But for most of us, it's like, I don't know, it's like trying to walk through a brick wall at times, right? Many of the religious Jews have been very carefully educated against anything relating to Yeshua. The chapter continues to prophesy the regathering of the nation of Israel, which will be a sign to the nations of God's faithfulness and will prove to the nations that Israel's God is the one and only true God. When they see Israel accepting Yeshua, you know what the world's going to say? What? How is that possible? Thus the chapter ends with this grand promise, "And all flesh will know that I, Adonai," that's Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, "am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob." Is Yeshua our Savior and Redeemer? Is he talking here? He calls himself Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. "And Adonai will be king over all the earth. In that day, Adonai, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, will be the only one, and his name the only one." That's the way I'd like to translate it. "He will not pardon your transgression." This angel of the Lord who comes has the right and authority to forgive sin, but he cannot overlook sin to sweep it away without consequence, since my name is in him. This is why he cannot overlook sin, because he owns the same infinite character and attributes of God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Now wait a minute. This angel of the Lord comes and says, his name is in me. What does that mean? From a Semitic standpoint, to have somebody else's name means to be what? To be them. So is Yeshua Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in the flesh? The answer is yes. Isaiah 42:8. "I am Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images." You mean only one God can have Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh as the name and truly have it? Yes, that's what he says. In Isaiah 45:5, "I am Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." Isaiah 45:22 through 23. "Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is no other. I have sworn by myself, the word has gone forth from my mouth in righteousness, and will not turn back, that to me every knee will bow, and every tongue will swear allegiance. I will not give my glory to another." On the back table, for those of you that want it, I put together this little thing for the kids, really, but it's on the Transfiguration. We've already talked about that. Somebody mentioned the Transfiguration. I think it was Kit. What was it? When they were up on the mountain and they saw Yeshua's glory, what glory was it? It's God's glory. He says there is no other. He says it twice, several times actually. "That to me every knee will bow and every tongue will swear allegiance." Now, when he says to me, in Isaiah 45, who's talking? Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Every knee will bow to me, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh says. Every tongue will swear allegiance. Well, Paul quotes this very text from Isaiah 45:23 in Philippians 2:10 and applies it to Yeshua. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed. I like the term bestowed. It doesn't mean that he gave it to him. He already had it. He announced it to be his. I've used the illustration before. When an Olympic champion wins the race, has he won it? Is he the champion? Okay. Then when he stands on the stand and they give him the gold medal, they declare him to be the champion. He already is the champion. Yeshua has always been. He has no beginning and no end. He was revealed, however, to us with the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. So bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Yeshua every knee will bow, and every of those who are in the heaven and on the earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Yeshua the Messiah is Lord, Kurios, to the glory of God the Father. Obviously, we're in a Greek text here, so he uses Kurios. So the name which is above every name, what name is that? Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. Straight, a perfect quote from Isaiah. That was applied by Isaiah to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. That Yeshua the Messiah is Lord, Kurios, to the glory of God the Father. Now, here's and I've already talked about bestowed. Here's the question. The Tetragrammaton, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, is found 6,828 times in the Tanakh of the Masoretic text. It might be just a few difference if you're looking at just one text or another, but the Masoretic text that we have, which is the standard text, that's the number 6,828. In the compiled text of the Septuagint, and I used Ralph's, which is the standard, to check this out, Kurios is used to translate Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh 6,376 times. This means that 93% of the time, the Septuagint uses Kurios to translate the Tetragrammaton. That the writers of the Apostolic Scriptures often quote from the Septuagint, it is clear that applying the title Kurios to Yeshua would have been regularly understood to be teaching that Yeshua, Kurios, is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in the flesh, which we find in John chapter 8. What did they do when he announced himself to be the Lord? They took up stones to stone him. They understood what he was saying. He said, you make yourself to be equal with God. How come it's so easy for them to understand and so difficult for our people sometimes to understand? We affirm the truth that Yeshua is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in the flesh, and yet this contains a mystery that is beyond our finite ability to fully explain. People are saying if you can't fully explain it, then you shouldn't believe it. Wrong. How many things in your life can you not fully explain, but you rest upon them and you practice them every day? I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me for sure what light is. I know they've gotten close. They said they've done some investigation of rolling particles and that kind of thing. Nobody has ever still explained to me how light can be particles and you can shine it through a glass prism. And it divides into different wavelengths. Can you take a particle and really shine it through a block of glass? I thought when you shoot particles at other particles, something bad happens. We use light all the time. We cannot explain it. 1 Timothy 3:16, by common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He was revealed in the flesh. So great is the mystery of godliness, not means our godliness, but it means God in the flesh, right? He was revealed in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on the world, taken up in glory. It's the common confession as far as Paul is concerned, and it's a mystery. To be revealed in the flesh. It's the Greek word mysterion, from which we get our word mystery. It means something that's hidden, that you don't have the answer to. What does revealed in the flesh mean? Fully human. He's not just subhuman. He's fully human. Vindicated in the Spirit. When was that? When he came up out of the water. And the voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen. Oh, what does that mean in the Hebrew? Obey. Seen by angels. When was that? Why do you come looking for the living amongst the dead? He's not here, he's risen. Proclaimed among the nations, the ingathering of the Gentiles. Read Acts. How often do we see in Acts 15? He says, the Gentiles are coming like crazy. What does that mean? He's fulfilling what Isaiah said. He's a light to the nations. All of a sudden, there's an influx of Gentiles coming to faith in the Messiah and being joined to the believing remnant of Israel. And it caused problems, didn't it? The Jews said, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles coming in? Believed on in the world, the gospel received in other regions and nations, and the expansion of the ecclesia in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Paul was part of that, right? He's talking about all these different people groups that he's witnessed to and have come to faith. Taken up in glory? Well, all of the apostles were there, and he ascended. And he said, I'll return in the same way. You like evidence? That's evidence. So, does it matter that he's Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh? Yes. Does it mean that we should just... This whole issue of the Trinity is big time in the Messianic movement. And a good number of main voices are saying, no, we don't believe in the Trinity. The bottom line is this. If Yeshua is not eternal and infinitely righteous, he could not be our sacrifice. There's no salvation. He has to be able to give his life for many, which means he cannot himself be finite. And one sin against God is an infinite transgression. He must be infinitely righteous. So, I wanted to emphasize that because our text has this angel of the Lord. I believe in this case, in our text, the angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnate appearance of Yeshua.